My uncle convinced me to invest $20,000 in his guaranteed business venture. 6 months later, I discovered he'd spent it all on gambling. I hired a forensic accountant, traced every transaction, and had him arrested for investment fraud. He's now serving 3 to 5 years and owes me $60,000 in restitution. I, 32M, trusted my uncle with $20,000, and it destroyed our family forever. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March. My uncle's voice carried that familiar mix of confidence and urgency that had always made him seem larger than life at family gatherings. He told me about this incredible opportunity, a tech startup that needed quick funding before their IPO launch. The returns were guaranteed, he said, minimum 300% within 6 months. His business partner had insider connections, and they were only offering this to family members. I should have hung up right there. But my uncle had always been the success story in our family. While my dad worked construction and my mom cleaned offices, he drove luxury cars and owned rental properties. He'd helped my cousin buy her first house and had paid for my grandmother's medical bills without blinking. When he offered to let me in on what he called the deal of a lifetime, I felt chosen. The $20,000 came from my savings account, money I'd been setting aside for a down payment on my own place. I'd been living in a cramped apartment for 3 years, watching my friends buy houses while I scraped together every dollar. This investment felt like my shortcut to financial freedom. My uncle insisted on cash. He said the business partner preferred to keep things simple, avoiding bank transfers that might complicate the tax situation later. I withdrew the money in hundreds, feeling both excited and nervous as I handed over the thick envelope at his kitchen table. He gave me a handwritten receipt and promised to send official paperwork within the week. The paperwork never came. For the first month, I didn't worry. My uncle texted regular updates about meetings with investors and progress on the IPO filing. He sent photos of himself at what looked like business dinners, always mentioning how well things were going. When I asked about the official documentation, he said his lawyer was still finalizing everything. By month 2, the updates became less frequent. My uncle started taking longer to respond to my texts, and when he did, his messages were shorter and more vague. He mentioned some regulatory delays and assured me that everything was still on track. I began to feel the first stirrings of unease. Month 3 brought the first real red flag. I ran into my cousin at a coffee shop, and she mentioned that her dad had been acting strange lately. He'd been staying out late, coming home irritable, and had snapped at her mom over minor things. When I casually asked if she knew anything about his business ventures, she looked confused. She said he'd been complaining about money lately, which seemed odd given his usual financial confidence. I decided to do some digging. The company name my uncle had mentioned yielded no results in business registration databases. The address he'd given me for their office turned out to be a UPS store. When I called the phone number on my receipt, it went straight to a generic voicemail that was never returned. The sick feeling in my stomach grew stronger each day. Month 4 was when I started getting desperate. I confronted my uncle directly, showing up at his house unannounced. He seemed genuinely surprised to see me, and for the first time, I noticed how tired he looked. His usual polished appearance had given way to wrinkled clothes and bloodshot eyes. When I pressed him about the investment, he became defensive, insisting that I needed to be patient with these types of deals. But something in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. The confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked like panic. I hired a private investigator the next day. The PI's report arrived 2 weeks later, and it shattered everything I thought I knew about my uncle. The surveillance photos showed him at 3 different casinos over the past 6 months, sometimes staying until dawn. Credit card records revealed a pattern of cash advances and ATM withdrawals that coincided perfectly with his gambling sessions. There were no business meetings, no startup company, no IPO filing. My $20,000 had been fed into slot machines and poker tables. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial loss. This wasn't just theft from a stranger, this was family. My uncle had looked me in the eye, shaken my hand, and stolen my future while pretending to secure it. I spent the next week in a rage-filled haze, alternating between wanting to confront him publicly and fantasizing about more creative forms of revenge. But anger without action is just suffering, and I decided to channel my fury into something productive. I researched forensic accountants and found one who specialized in financial fraud cases. She was expensive, but I figured it was an investment in justice. When I explained the situation, She told me that what my uncle had done wasn't just morally wrong, it was legally fraud. Investment fraud, to be specific, which carried serious criminal penalties. The forensic accountant got to work immediately. She subpoenaed bank records, traced transaction histories, and built a comprehensive timeline of where my money had gone. The evidence was damning. My $20,000 had been deposited into my uncle's personal account and then systematically withdrawn at casinos over the following weeks. But the investigation revealed something even more shocking. I wasn't his only victim. The forensic accountant discovered that my uncle had pulled similar schemes on at least 4 other people over the past year. A neighbor had invested $15,000 in what he thought was a real estate flip. A coworker had given him $12,000 for a supposed cryptocurrency opportunity. Even my own cousin had lent him $8,000 for what she believed was a short-term business loan. The total amount of his fraud exceeded $70,000. Armed with this evidence, I went to the police. The detective assigned to the case was initially skeptical. Family financial disputes rarely resulted in criminal charges. But when I presented the forensic accountant's report, his attitude changed completely. The paper trail was so clear and comprehensive that he said it was one of the strongest fraud cases he'd seen. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning. I wasn't there to see it, but my cousin called me in tears, saying that police had shown up at her father's workplace and led him away in handcuffs. The local news picked up the story that evening, describing it as a family investment fraud scheme that had victimized multiple people. My uncle's mugshot appeared on the evening news, and I felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. This was the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had slipped me $20 bills at Christmas, who had been a fixture at every family gathering for 30 years. Now he was just another criminal in an orange jumpsuit. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence and multiple victims, my uncle's lawyer advised him to accept a plea deal. He pled guilty to investment fraud and was sentenced to 3 to 5 years in state prison. The judge also ordered him to pay restitution to all his victims, with interest and penalties bringing my total award to $60,000. Update 1. The restitution process has been more complicated than I expected. My uncle's assets were seized and liquidated, but they only covered about half of what he owed to all his victims. His house went into foreclosure, his cars were repossessed, and his rental properties were sold at auction. I received an initial payment of $12,000, with the remainder to be paid through garnished wages once he's released from prison. The impact on our family has been devastating. My aunt filed for divorce within a month of his arrest, claiming she had no knowledge of his gambling addiction or fraudulent activities. Some family members believe her, others don't. Holiday gatherings have become tense affairs where people choose sides and avoid certain topics. My cousin has barely spoken to me since the arrest. She blames me for destroying her family, even though her father's actions are what caused the destruction. She says I should have handled it privately, that involving the police was an overreaction. But I know that if I hadn't acted, he would have continued victimizing people. The other victims have been more supportive. We've formed an informal support group, sharing updates about the restitution process and helping each other navigate the legal system. It's been oddly comforting to know that I wasn't alone in being deceived by someone I trusted. Update 2. 6 months after the sentencing, I received an unexpected call from the prison. My uncle wanted to speak with me. Against my better judgment, I agreed to visit him. The man I saw in the visiting room was barely recognizable. Prison had aged him dramatically, and the confident swagger that had defined him was completely gone. He looked broken, defeated, and genuinely remorseful. He apologized repeatedly, explaining that his gambling addiction had spiraled out of control after he'd lost a significant amount of money in the stock market. He'd started with small bets, thinking he could win back his losses, but the addiction had consumed him completely. By the time he'd approached me for the investment, he was already in debt to dangerous people and desperate for any source of cash. He told me that he'd convinced himself that he would win big and be able to pay everyone back with interest. In his twisted logic, he wasn't stealing from family. He was borrowing from them to secure everyone's financial future. The delusion had been so complete that he'd actually believed his own lies. I listened to his explanation without saying much. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, to find some way to forgive and move forward. But the damage was too extensive, the betrayal too deep. I told him that I hoped he would get the help he needed for his addiction, but that our relationship was over. He nodded sadly and said he understood. As I walked away from the prison, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. Seeing him in that environment, broken and paying the consequences for his actions, had finally satisfied the need for justice that had driven me through the entire ordeal. Update 3. It's been 2 years since my uncle's arrest, and I'm writing this final update from the living room of my new house. The restitution payments have been slow but steady, and combined with the insurance settlement from a class action lawsuit against the casinos that had enabled his addiction, I eventually recovered most of my original investment. More importantly, the experience taught me valuable lessons about trust, family, and standing up for myself. I learned that blood relationships don't excuse criminal behavior, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to hold them accountable for their actions. My uncle was released on parole last month after serving 2.5 years. He's living in a halfway house and working at a warehouse, with his wages still being garnished to pay restitution. He sent me a letter asking if we could meet, but I'm not ready for that conversation yet. Maybe someday, but not now. The family dynamics have slowly started to heal. My cousin and I have had several difficult conversations, and while our relationship will never be the same, we've reached a place of mutual understanding. She's acknowledged that her father's actions were wrong, and I've accepted that my pursuit of justice caused collateral damage to innocent family members. The other victims have all received their restitution payments, and we've maintained our informal support network. We meet occasionally for coffee, and it's become a source of strength to know that we survived this experience together. Looking back, I'm proud of how I handled the situation. I could have let anger consume me, or I could have stayed silent to preserve family harmony. Instead, I chose justice, even when it was difficult and painful. My uncle's actions destroyed trust and caused financial hardship, but my response protected other potential victims and held him accountable for his crimes. The $20,000 I lost was significant, but the $60,000 in restitution I ultimately received was never really about the money. It was about proving that actions have consequences, that trust has value, and that sometimes the people we love most are capable of hurting us the deepest. I sleep better at night knowing that I stood up for myself and others, even when it meant destroying relationships and facing family criticism. Justice isn't always comfortable, but it's always necessary. And if my uncle ever tries to run another scheme, there's now a paper trail and a criminal record that will make it much harder for him to find new victims. Sometimes the best revenge is simply making sure the person can't hurt anyone else the same way they hurt you.